April 8, 1943. The morning sky over northern France was thin and cold. Its clouds stretched like gauze across a pale sun. Below, the field still bore the scars of winter, mud, frost, and the restless machinery of war. Above those clouds, however, something new had arrived. The German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 were used the sound of familiar engines, the tight whine of Messerschmitts, the throaty growl of their own Focke-Wulfs. But this sound was different. It was deeper, heavier, more deliberate. When they first saw it, they laughed. One pilot even radioed, "It looks like a milk jug with wings." His comrades chuckled. But laughter that morning would be short-lived. The strange American fighter climbing into their airspace was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft so large and so brutally overbuilt that even its designers nicknamed it the Jug. At first glance, it seemed too heavy to fight, too bulky to dance with the sleek, predatory lines of the German FW-190. But the Americans hadn't built it to dance. They had built it to survive and to kill. In its broad wings waited 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each one capable of spitting 1,000 rounds per minute. Together, they could carve metal like a welder's torch. Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski of a US-56 fighter group would later recall the first time he flew it in combat. "It wasn't graceful," he said with a grin years later. "But grace doesn't win a war. Firepower does." His squadron had been assigned to escort B-17 bombers on their way to targets deep inside occupied Europe, a task that had already claimed too many American lives. Before the P-47, bombers often flew alone into the teeth of German defenses, shredded by FW-190s and Bf-109s before they even reached their targets. The Thunderbolt was meant to change that equation, to meet the Luftwaffe head-on at altitude and break its grip on the sky. That morning, the first real test came swiftly. Near Abbeville, a group of German fighters climbed toward the incoming formation. The FW-190 was still the pride of the Luftwaffe, compact, agile, and lethal with its mix of 20mm cannons and machine guns. Its pilots were confident. They'd been the hunters for years. Major Karl-Heinz Koch, a decorated ace, rolled his 190 into an attack dive, targeting what he thought was a slow, cumbersome escort. The American plane looked easy enough, a big, round-nosed brute with no finesse. But as Koch closed the distance, something unexpected happened. The P-47 didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, it held its course, then dropped its nose slightly, diving with a speed no German fighter could match. Koch followed, but the Thunderbolt kept accelerating, the air howling against its thick frame. Then came a flash, 8 converging lines of fire that met his cockpit in a single brutal instant. Koch's plane exploded into fragments before he had time to cry out. His wingmen pulled away in shock. The Americans had arrived. Down below, Gabreski's squadron leader, Hubert "Hub" Zemke, watched the engagement unfold. Zemke was not a romantic man. He was analytical, cool, almost cold in the cockpit, but even he was taken aback by the Thunderbolt's sheer violence. "The Jug," he would later write, "didn't fight like a fighter. It fought like a hammer dropped from heaven." By the end of that day, 2 FW-190s were down, 1 confirmed destroyed, and another limped home trailing smoke. The Americans lost none. Yet victory was not the same as mastery. The Thunderbolt still had its flaws. It climbed slowly, and its range was painfully short. Pilots often joked that they spent half their missions worrying about fuel and the other half about altitude. But those who flew it began to understand its personality, a strange blend of stubbornness and loyalty. When AP-47 took a hit, it didn't fall apart. It shrugged. One pilot compared it to a prize fighter who doesn't know when to quit. For the Germans, the shock went deeper than the loss of a few aircraft. They had spent years believing in their technical superiority, in the perfection of the FW-190's design, a balance of speed, agility, and firepower that no enemy could match. The Thunderbolt broke that illusion. Its engine roared louder, its guns hit harder, and its sheer toughness mocked every rule of aerial combat they had trusted. Where the FW-190 was an artist blade, the P-47 was an iron club, and it worked. Inside one of those silver giants, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson learned that lesson firsthand. On a later mission that spring, his Thunderbolt was ambushed by a pair of FW-190s. Cannon shells tore through his fuselage. Oil and smoke filled his cockpit. His guns were jammed, and his canopy refused to open. Johnson braced for the end, until he realized the engine was still running. With his instruments shattered and blood running down his neck, he coaxed the jug home across the channel. When he landed, mechanics counted more than 200 bullet holes in the plane. The propeller was still spinning. "That's when I knew," Johnson later said, "that this wasn't a fighter. It was a fortress that happened to fly." Back in Berlin, Luftwaffe command dismissed the reports at first. Propaganda insisted the new American aircraft was just another overweight experiment. Yet in the debriefing rooms of Western France, the tone was different. Young German pilots spoke of long bursts of gunfire that seemed impossible to escape. One described being caught in a river of light. Another said, "It was like fighting a thunderstorm. You didn't dodge it, you endured it." The Americans, meanwhile, were beginning to find rhythm. Every mission refined their tactics. Use altitude, dive hard, strike once, and climb away before the enemy could recover. It was a doctrine that suited the jug perfectly. Pilots like Zemke taught their men to think like wolves, never dogfight, always pounce. The results spoke for themselves. By the end of April, bomber losses had decreased, and Luftwaffe squadrons were retreating deeper inland to avoid ambush. Still, even amid success, the P-47 pilots carried a quiet humility. They knew the sky was unpredictable and the enemy was skilled. Between missions, they joked about their aircraft size, how it could hide a car game under its wings, how it looked more like a tractor than a fighter. But beneath the humor was pride. "The jug takes care of you," one said. "You take care of her, she'll bring you home." As the spring turned to summer, the Thunderbolt's legend grew. Photographs from gun cameras showed FW-190s breaking apart under streams of tracer fire. Reports on the ground describe American fighters diving at terrifying speeds, engines screaming as they pulled out just feet above the trees. German mechanics began painting heavier armor on their aircraft, desperate to withstand the new threat. But even that wasn't enough. By the time April gave way to May, one truth had become undeniable. The Luftwaffe's days of dominance were numbered. Their elegant, precise machines were being undone by something they had underestimated, a loud, lumbering brute that fought without elegance, but with absolute conviction. And as the sun set over the battered airfields of France, a few German pilots stood watching the contrails fading into the western horizon. "The Americans," one of them muttered, "have built a monster." He wasn't wrong. What none of them knew yet was that this monster was only beginning to roar. The thunder that came from the west would not fade. It would only grow louder. By the summer of 1943, the air over Europe had turned into a proving ground where metal met willpower. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once doubted by its own pilots and ridiculed by the Luftwaffe, was now carving its reputation one mission at a time. Yet the Germans still believed in the supremacy of the FW-190, their butcher bird. Sleek, nimble, and armed with 20-millimeter cannons, it had terrorized Allied bombers for nearly 2 years. To most Luftwaffe pilots, the arrival of the Thunderbolt was not a crisis, but an invitation. They wanted to test this American brick and prove that German precision could still outfly American brute strength. Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, understood that challenge better than anyone. He studied enemy aircraft like a chess master studies his opponent's next move. Zemke was a lean man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried quiet authority, the kind that made even veteran pilots listen. Before each mission, he would gather his men around a map and speak with calm precision. "The FW-190, he'd say, is fast below 20,000 feet. Don't fight it there. Take it where it can't breathe." He pointed upward, tapping the map with a pencil. "Up here, this is where we own them." The men trusted him, though they joked that the only thing heavier than their P-47s was Zemke's confidence. They called themselves Zemke's Wolf Pack, a name that blended respect with a touch of irony. They weren't wolves by nature. Most were farm boys, mechanics, or college students who had learned to fly just a year earlier. But in the sky, under Zemke's command, they hunted as one. Opposite them, in a Luftwaffe airfield near Lille, Captain Otto went prepared for his own mission. Went was a veteran, a disciplined flyer who had survived the Eastern Front and carried the weary arrogance of those who had seen too much war. He didn't underestimate the Americans. He simply didn't fear them. "Their planes are big," he told his young wingman. "Big targets make easy kills." He said it without malice, just certainty. The FW-190 had saved his life more than once, and he believed in its strength. What he didn't yet know was that the American brick carried 8 machine guns that could spit nearly 100 rounds per second, and at that rate, a single burst could erase a fighter from the sky before its pilot could blink. Their encounter came on a clear morning in June. The 56th Fighter Group had been sent to escort bombers targeting rail yards in western Germany. High above the bomber formations, Zemke's squadron cruised at 27,000 feet, engines rumbling steadily. Below, the silver lines of B-17s crawled eastward, their contrails curling like threads of smoke. The radios were quiet, too quiet. Then came the warning, "Bandits! 12 o'clock high." Went in his FW-190's dove from the sun, guns flashing. The German attack was textbook, precise, timed, deadly. The first B-17 in formation exploded into flame, its right wing shearing away. But the Americans were ready. Zemke's voice cut through the static. "Break. Wolves, go down." The Thunderbolts peeled away from their high position, dropping like meteors. The air trembled as their engines hit full throttle. The FW-190s banked hard to engage, expecting the Americans to lose speed in the dive. But the P-47 was heavier, denser, and gravity was its ally. It gained speed faster than the German fighters could imagine. When tried to pull up, but by then, the sky behind him erupted in white fire. 8 converging streams of .50 caliber tracers tore across his path. He rolled instinctively, but it was too late. The Jug's guns had found their mark. His wings shattered. Smoke and flame engulfed his cockpit. He managed to bail out, his parachute blooming above the burning wreckage as the P-47 streaked past, trailing the faint scent of gunpowder and oil. On the ground later, when admitted to commanders, "I never saw such fire. It was not one gun, it was a wall." His report would later circulate among Luftwaffe squadrons, a warning wrapped in disbelief. For the Americans, the engagement was validation. The Thunderbolt's 850s weren't just weapons, they were equalizers. In the words of Lieutenant Walker Mahiran, "You didn't need to be the best shot in the world. If you pointed that many guns in the right direction, something was going to die." Each gun spat out bullets at nearly 3,000 feet per second, their combined rate of fire forming a storm that could saw through armor, wings, and fuel tanks in seconds. Against the lighter German planes, it was devastating. Yet the power came with a burden. Pilots quickly learned that firing all 8 guns at once shook the aircraft violently. It was like punching your own plane in the chest. One said. Still, they pulled the trigger willingly, knowing each burst could mean one less enemy stalking the bombers below. The German pilots began to notice, too. They could no longer afford long chases or head-on attacks. The Thunderbolt's armor shrugged off hits that would have destroyed a Spitfire. Its massive radial engine could take bullets, even cannon shells, and keep turning. Luftwaffe intelligence reports soon carried new instructions. Avoid protracted engagements with the American heavy fighter. Attack and disengage rapidly. It was the first written acknowledgement that the FW-190 was no longer the undisputed hunter of the skies. Zemke's men adapted quickly. They refined their tactics around the Jug's strengths, altitude, durability, and raw firepower. Instead of turning fights, they performed diving attacks, using their superior speed to strike and escape. Boom and zoom, Gabreski called it. It became the Thunderbolt's signature move. A violent, surgical descent, a burst of 8 guns, and a climb back to safety before the enemy could retaliate. It wasn't elegant, but it worked with ruthless consistency. On one mission, Gabreski found himself trailing an FW-190 at 18,000 feet. The German tried every trick, barrel rolls, dives, even a desperate loop, but the Jug stayed on him. When Gabreski finally squeezed the trigger, the guns roared in unison, and the 190 vanished in a flash of orange and black. Back on base, when asked how it felt, he smiled faintly, like throwing thunder at a bird. For the pilots of the 56, victories brought pride, but also fatigue. Each mission carried the weight of expectation. Protect the bombers, destroy the hunters, survive. They celebrated each return with quiet relief rather than cheers. In their tents at night, they spoke of the Germans with respect. "They're damn good," Zemke would say. "That's why beating them means something." His men nodded, understanding that mastery wasn't arrogance. It was endurance. By late summer, the shift in air superiority was undeniable. German pilots began to fly lower, avoiding the high altitudes where the P-47 excelled. The Luftwaffe's early war confidence had curdled into frustration. For years, they had been the apex predators. Now, they were prey learning to look over their shoulders. On the tarmac in England, Zemke stood watching his returning squadron. The planes were battered, their fuselages scarred with bullet holes and soot, but they were home. Mechanics swarmed around them, wiping oil from wings, reloading ammunition. A faint smile crossed Zemke's face. "She's ugly," he murmured to no one in particular, "but she's ours." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a dim orange. Far to the east, the Luftwaffe was regrouping, preparing new tactics, new weapons, determined to reclaim their skies. But Zemke and his men knew better. They had seen what the Jug could do, how it could endure punishment and return fire with merciless precision. The war in the air was far from over. But for the first time, the Americans weren't merely surviving. They were dictating the fight. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of 850 still rumbled to the clouds, promising that the thunder had only begun. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had changed tone. What had once been a contest of daring maneuvers and fleeting duels was now a grinding, relentless campaign, a test of endurance, will, and machine. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its dominance, was beginning to fray under the strain. Its veterans were exhausted, its replacements younger and less trained, and its airfields now lived under constant threat. For the Americans, the change was tangible. Every time the Thunderbolts roared into the sky, the Luftwaffe came a little slower, a little less sure. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Colonel Hubert Zemke knew it better than anyone. His wolf pack had earned a reputation among both friend and foe, disciplined, methodical, merciless. But the more victories they claimed, the more dangerous their missions became. Bomber formations were pushing deeper into Germany, past the relative safety of France, and into the industrial heart of the Reich. The escorts now faced enemy fighters in greater numbers, often over enemy airfields, where the odds were stacked against them. And yet, Zemke's pilots kept climbing. Francis Gaby Gabreski, now one of the group's most experienced flyers, had grown into a quiet pillar within the squadron. The boyish bravado of his early days had faded, replaced by a measured calm that came from surviving too many close calls. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was flying anyway. Each time he strapped into the Jug, he carried a memory of those who hadn't made it back. But he also carried faith in the plane and his crew, in Zemke's leadership. The Thunderbolt, ugly and unyielding, had become a part of him. "It's not grace that wins," he had once told a new pilot. "It's grit." The enemy was adapting too. In early 1944, German engineers modified the FW-190 into heavier armed variants designed to attack bombers and break through defensive fire. They added armor plates and heavier cannons, trading speed for power. It was a desperate measure, and desperation was showing in every engagement. Still, the FW-190 remained a formidable opponent, especially in the hands of seasoned aces like Heinrich Keller, a pilot who had once flown under the legendary Adolf Galland. Keller had no illusions about the war's direction, but he flew with a personal creed. "As long as I'm in the air, they can't claim the sky." The two sides met one cold morning over the Ruhr Valley, where smoke from the factories below mingled with the frost. The bombers were on their way to Ham, an important railway junction, and Zemke's group was a high escort. The radio crackle was short, tense exchanges, the familiar static symphony of a mission in motion. From his cockpit, Bresky scanned the horizon, his breath fogging the glass. Then he saw them, dark specks forming against the sun, 20 or more, coming fast. "Bandits inbound, 10 o'clock high," he called out. Zemke's calm voice followed. "Copy. Wolves, tighten up. Remember your training. Dive and climb. Make them bleed for every pass." The German formation split in two, half going for bombers, the other half aiming to draw off the escorts. Keller led his section into a steep climb, his eyes locked on the silver shapes above. "Pick the biggest one," he told his wingman, "and aim for its heart." The sky erupted in chaos. Tracers streaked between clouds like angry comets. The roar of engines merged into a single violent hum that seemed to swallow the air itself. Bresky rolled his jug into a dive, the heavy aircraft accelerating with terrifying momentum. He caught a 190 braking away from the bombers and opened fire. The 8 Brownings spoke in unison, their rhythmic thunder echoing through the cockpit. The German plane disintegrated mid-turn, scattering into fragments that vanished into the haze below. But there was no time to watch. Another enemy fighter flashed past his canopy, so close that Bresky could see the pilot's pale face, eyes wide with panic. He pulled up sharply, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, his engine screaming. The Thunderbolt could not twist like a Spitfire, but it didn't need to. It climbed like a mountain rising from the earth, defying the chase. Below him, Keller tried to follow, but his engine began to sputter under the strain. He cursed and rolled away, searching for altitude he couldn't reach. Zemke's voice returned, calm but edged with urgency. "Keep the pressure. Don't linger. Hit and climb." The method was brutal but effective. Within minutes, the air battle fractured, the Germans breaking apart. The Americans were forming, attacking again in coordinated bursts. It was less a duel and more an execution, a storm of gunfire and metal where tactics outweighed flair. On the ground below, factory workers looked up from their shattered roofs and saw streaks of white across the heavens. They didn't know who was winning, only that the sky itself seemed to be tearing apart. After 20 minutes of combat, the Luftwaffe withdrew. The bombers continued unchallenged toward Ham, leaving behind horizons scarred with smoke trails and falling debris. When the Wolf Pack regrouped, 2 Thunderbolts were missing, 1 pilot confirmed killed. But 7 German fighters had gone down. The odds were shifting faster than anyone had expected. Back at their base in England, the men of the 56th gathered around their commander. Zemke, as always, was reserved. He congratulated them briefly, then reminded them that the war wasn't won yet. Still, even his stoic features softened when he looked at his men, dirty, exhausted, but alive. "You've turned the tide," he said quietly. "Don't ever forget that." Bresky cleaned the guns of his P-47 that evening, hands blackened with oil. Around him, laughter and music drifted faintly from the mess tent. He wasn't celebrating. He was thinking of the German pilot he'd seen that morning, the face frozen in surprise before his plane vanished. In another world, he thought, that man could have been sitting across from him, talking about engines and weather. But in this world, only one of them had made a home. For the Germans, the sense of inevitability grew heavier with each passing week. Keller survived the fight, but returned to a base in disarray. Few spare parts, dwindling fuel, new recruits barely old enough to shave. "We are fighting ghosts," he wrote in his diary. Machines that rise from the clouds, hit, and vanish before we can even curse them. The Thunderbolt had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the Americans' growing industrial and tactical dominance, a machine that embodied persistence. It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. And honesty in war was power. What you saw was what you got, and what you got was unstoppable. By the spring of 1944, even German command knew the truth. They could no longer win by technology alone. The P-47s, now armed with bombs and rockets, had begun attacking airfields, trains, and convoys, striking not just planes but the very infrastructure of the Luftwaffe. For every German fighter destroyed in the air, another was lost on the ground before it ever took off. The war in the sky had turned from a contest into a collapse. Yet amidst the fading roar, one thing endured, the respect between enemies. Bresky and Keller never met, but they were bound by the same code, The same quiet understanding of what it meant to fight for something larger than oneself. As the sun dipped behind the airfields of England that evening, Gabreski looked west, where new missions awaited. The sky was peaceful for the moment, painted in soft gold. But he knew it wouldn't last. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new orders were being written, new targets chosen. The Thunderbolts would fly again. And as long as they did, the sound of their 850s would echo through the clouds, a reminder that the storm was far from over.